Hello, my name is Jennifer Long. I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma. I specialize in macroeconomic theory and American economic history. The question the conference organizers have put before me is about the economic impacts of racial stratification. This is, of course, a huge and wide-ranging issue, so I want to concentrate on the issue that is, in my view, the most significant and worrisome barrier to full participation in the American economy for Black Americans, the disparity of wealth. But before I go there, I have to begin with a disclaimer. You would think that asking an economist to discuss the economics of race would be the most common sense thing in the world. But it isn't, simply because the vast majority of economists are not prepared to talk about issues of race at all. Clearly, this has huge ramifications for addressing the problem of racial wealth disparity, because any sort of public policy will be impossible if those of us who call ourselves economists will not even acknowledge that the economic issue exists in the first place. So what holds economists back from talking about the problem of racial stratification? Well, quite simply, our training holds us back. Economists struggle to think about the economic impacts of race because the standard theory that is taught in almost all economics departments in all colleges and universities around the country has no place for the idea of race or any other social categories that we know actually matter in the real world. Now, there are two huge problems with the standard economic model that stand in our way of thinking clearly and honestly about race. First, the standard economic model assumes that all individuals are rational and make economic decisions based solely on their own self-interest, without bringing into play categories of race, gender, ethnicity that we actually know in the real world are important. The idea is that discrimination, whether it's in the labor market, the housing market, any market, will be inefficient for everyone involved. We'll talk about that in a second. The idea then is that there must be rational reasons for individuals to engage in inefficient behavior of treating people differently simply because of the social category to which they belong. What the standard economic model assumes then is that rational people who discriminate must be doing so because they have a so-called taste for discrimination. They prefer to do it. Now, the next assumption of theory is that we don't have to worry about those individuals who have a taste or a preference for discriminating in the markets that they encounter, because the discrimination cannot last and will not have lasting effects. Instead, the markets will solve this problem. For example, consumers who discriminate will be punished by higher prices, so they will stop choosing where to shop based on the race or gender or ethnicity of the people who are selling the products. Employers who discriminate will be punished by having to pay higher wages, and they will miss out on the productive workers and will thus be driven out of business by our competitors. Discrimination and thus unequal economic outcomes based on anything except individual effort is simply an impossibility for the standard economic theory. Except, of course, that unequal economic outcomes are possible in the real world. These theoretical assumptions that make it so difficult for most economists to see beyond our training and to actually think about the impact of race are not just assumptions needed to make a model work within our own discipline. It's much, much bigger than that. The effects are much bigger than that. If you put these ideas together, you get a picture of capitalism as a whole that explicitly justifies colonization and institutionalized racism. You come to the conclusion after you study this economic model for so long, or at least you understand the justification, that capitalism is good because it efficiently uses resources to their highest uses. The other part of the story that we get from this standard economic model is that the US economy was built on innovation, risk-taking, manifest destiny, not on forced labor and theft of land. And the people who worked so hard to build this American version of capitalism were not guilty of racism and hatred because markets are impersonal. None of this is personal for the model of economics that predominates in our culture. Now, note that this is not just the justification for capitalism within the discipline of economics. This is the grand narrative of America, that story that prevents us from hearing all other stories, the story that prevents us from talking about, let alone addressing, the problem of racial inequity. Because we know, outside of this model and this set of assumptions, that market forces will not end discrimination. In fact, if markets are built on the foundation of racism, markets will enshrine and reward racial discrimination. We know this. A lot of economists challenge the idea of the standard model and allege and build cases for the fact that individual discrimination is not actually the problem here, that it's institutional discrimination where racist ideas and policies permeate the very rules of this game that we call capitalism, and that unequal outcomes are the cumulative effect of centuries of racist ideas and policies. It's hard to listen to these voices, though, because it's very difficult to shout loud enough to be heard over that grand narrative. And as we turn our attention now to the issue of wealth, keep in mind this idea of the grand narrative that permeates economics, because it's going to show up in how we talk about wealth in general. So let's turn to the issue of wealth in the United States. We know that race impacts every economic variable that we track: income, educational attainment, employment, poverty, health outcomes, everything, and on and on and on. I want to argue, though, that wealth disparity is the most critical economic difference in the United States. Wealth is easily defined in economics, right? Wealth is your accumulated stock of assets. But wealth means so much more than just a number on your IRA statement or the value of your house. Wealth is the thing that gives people choices. Wealth is the thing that gives families security and the ability to take risks in their lives. Wealth means sending your kids to college without burdensome debt. Wealth means helping your kids with a down payment for their house or your grandchildren for their house. Wealth means that a health crisis or a pandemic won't bankrupt the family and set that family back for generations. But wealth is not distributed equitably across the US. This is something that we have known for a very long time. There is no other way to look at these statistics other than to see a vast inequality in the way that wealth is distributed in the US. I pulled some data from the Federal Reserve just to refresh my memory and see if the numbers had changed. And they have. They've gotten a little bit worse since the last time I took a look. So here's some data for you from the Federal Reserve, who keeps track of these sorts of things. And this data is from 2019. So keep in mind that this is before the pandemic has hit. The pandemic is going to make everything worse. I have a feeling. I think most economists think that that is going to make the wealth disparity even worse. So here's some data. In 2019, the median wealth, so the wealth that the household in the middle of the distribution has, the median wealth for a white American family is right around $188,000. So their accumulated stock of assets, their retirement funds, their saving, their house, their cars, The median for a white American family is $188,200. The median wealth for a black family is $24,100, a wealth gap of a little over $164,000. Now, note that median wealth gives the experience of a perhaps typical family, but does not reflect the bulk of national wealth that is held by the very richest households. To look at that, we have to look at average wealth, which is more influenced by the very rich families and does not characterize the typical experience. If we look at average instead of median, the white average wealth goes up to almost $930,000, which is almost 7 times greater than the black average wealth of $138,000. So there is no way to explain or to try to say that that wealth gap does not exist. It clearly does. The argument for economists and for policymakers is to try to explain where that wealth gap comes from. What are the reasons that that huge amount of disparity exists within the U.S. economy? I think it's easier to start perhaps with some explanations that do not work to explain that wealth gap. And these are the ones that you will hear most commonly, not just from economists, but from the media as well. And think back to that, grand narrative we talked about and how all of these failed explanations rely on that same set of assumptions about the grand narrative, that people who work hard get ahead, people who make the right individual choices get ahead. We're about to see that those explanations fall apart when it comes to the racial gap in wealth in the United States. So here are some typical arguments or some typical explanations for why the racial wealth gap exists. Number one, maybe the racial wealth gap exists simply because Black Americans have less income than white Americans. That seems like it might make sense, if for no other reason that the flow of income can be added to the stock of accumulated wealth. It seems to make some logical sense. But no, the numbers clearly do not bear out that explanation. The racial wealth gap is not about some people are poor and some people have a lot of income, so they get to accumulate more assets over time. Let me give you a fairly stunning statistic here, as most of these are. Poor white families who earn less than $27,000 a year hold nearly the same amount of wealth as Black American families who earn about $75,000 a year. Black full-time workers have a lower median net worth than unemployed white workers. Work is not the reason that this racial wealth gap exists. Clearly, the statistics do not bear that out. A second possible explanation. Maybe Black Americans are less wealthy than white Americans because they do not have the education levels it takes to get those good jobs. And perhaps they don't have the education level to save for the future and to bridge that gap between current income and savings. Again, seems like a logical connection. The data, however, again, does not bear out that possible explanation. Black household heads, so head of the household with a college degree, have about $10,000 less in median net worth than the head of white households who never graduated from high school. Education is not the reason here. College simply does not pay off for Black Americans the way it does for other groups. Black college graduates are about as likely to be unemployed as white Americans with a high school diploma, and Black Americans with a college education hold less wealth than white Americans, again, who have not even completed high school. To make matters worse, Black students who do go to college are the most likely to have to borrow to pay for college and then to borrow more. That debt in turn means that Black students cannot start saving immediately upon graduation when they get their first job, like their less debt-burdened white peers. Less wealth leads to more educational debt, which leads to less wealth, and the circle continues. College, any education, simply does not pay off for Black Americans the way it does for white Americans. Third possible explanation. Maybe Black Americans are less wealthy than their white counterparts because they don't have the correct family structure. This is an old explanation. The explanation is simple and goes like this. Hey, Black Americans have too many single-parent households, and single-parent households will only have one stream of income, therefore they will be less wealthy. Again, the answer is astoundingly clear from the data. Family structure has very, very little, if any at all, explanatory power for why Black Americans are less wealthy than white Americans. Being a married two-parent Black family still puts you far from white wealth levels. Let me give you a couple statistics again. Single white women with children have as high of a net worth as Black women with no children, and single white parents have more than twice the wealth of married Black parents. Marriage isn't the key here for Black families to accumulate the same amount of wealth as white married families have. This may be the most stunning statistic I give you throughout our time together, and it's the one that worries me incredibly as an economist. If we look at single white mothers and Black single mothers, we get a stunning difference in median net worth. White single mothers have a very low median net worth, around $3,000. Single Black mothers, on the other hand, have zero net worth, which is going to impact everything about how they make choices for their futures and the future of their children. It's a stunning statistic. Marriage is not the reason. Number 4, our fourth possible explanation for this racial wealth gap. Maybe Black Americans are less wealthy than white Americans because they don't own homes at the same rate. Houses are, after all, the largest source of wealth for all Americans, no matter what racial group they belong to. But we're back to a familiar answer to our familiar question here. Education is not the same sort of asset for Black families as for white families. Income is not the same asset for Black families as for white families. And houses are simply not the same asset for Black families as for white families. Black Americans have mortgages with worse terms, higher interest rates, even with equal credit worthiness. And homes in Black neighborhoods do not appreciate in value at the same rate as those in neighborhoods that are thought of as being white neighborhoods. Clearly because housing prices are still driven by the perception of the racial makeups of those communities. According to Duke University economist William Darity, who was one of the leaders in thinking about the economic effects of a wealth disparity, says the ability to purchase a home in the first place is seldom a result of just the hard work and frugality of the buyer. Instead, he says, the ability to purchase a home in the first place is actually mostly a factor of parental wealth and the wealth of your grandparents. It's that intergenerational wealth that facilitates the acquisition of a home. That idea is the key to this entire conversation. Wealth is intergenerational. That grand narrative is wrong. Making the right choices, getting an education, having the right sort of family, working full time at a good paying job, putting a down payment on a house, none of that guarantees wealth. The only thing that explains the wealth gap across racial lines in the United States is the fact that wealth is intergenerational. Most wealth is passed down in the form of land and houses, growing as each generation is given a boost from the previous generation, allowing the next generation to accumulate more. So here's what we know. Black Americans have systematically been denied land and home ownership. Land was systematically taken from Native Americans as well, which is a completely different conversation. It might not surprise you to know that wealth statistics about Native Americans simply are not reported at all by the government. That is an even worse story in a lot of ways. It is not just that Black Americans are made poorer because of the lack of home ownership or the lack of land ownership. White Americans are made wealthier because of land ownership, so that gap continually widens. This goes back centuries, as you all well know. At the end of the Civil War, the government makes a conscious decision to not give land to newly freed Americans, even though there are many, many calls for reparations in terms of land. With the Homestead Act, we see millions of acres of land effectively given to Americans, effectively given to white Americans. From 1868 to 1934, the federal government gave away 246 million acres of land, nearly 10% of all the land in America. 1.6 million white households received part of that land. Only 4,000 to 5,000 Black applicants ever received any homestead land. Estimates are that nearly 46 million Americans today, almost all of them white, nearly 20% of all American adults, descend from those homesteaders. And property in terms of land or houses that Black Americans did somehow manage to accumulate against the work of the federal government was always in danger of destruction. Those of us here in Oklahoma know too well the story of Greenwood and the destruction of property there. And of course, obstacles remain today. Even if discrimination in housing, land, and home ownership stopped today, which is a big assumption, that would not reset the real estate values so that homes in redlined Black neighborhoods whose prices were artificially deflated would be valued the same as identical homes in white neighborhoods, which had been artificially inflated. Wealth is intergenerational, tied to land and homes. Families who own land in the past can make investments in their children that will increase their wealth into the future. Education, down payments for houses. One reason wealth holding is relatively high among white families is they are considerably more likely to have received either an inheritance or a gift, a down payment from a parent or a grandparent or a family friend. Black families are far less likely to receive down payment assistance from their parents or anyone, delaying their transition into home ownership. The wealth that housing and land represents creates choices and safety. The typical Black family in the U.S. has about $2,000 or less in liquid savings. The typical white family has more than 4 times that amount. Those gaps in emergency savings are particularly relevant in light of the pandemic and associated job losses. Recent research has suggested that without the cash assistance from the CARES Act, there would be large disparities by race in the share of families who could cover their normal recurring expenses if they were to lose their jobs for 6 months or more. Just 14% of Black families, just 10% of Hispanic families in the US have enough savings to cover 6 months of expenses. White Americans, it's about 36%. Still low, but clearly that racial gap exists in savings rates as well. So, those who have ancestors who owned land and houses have a built-in advantage, regardless of their own individual decisions. The accumulated wealth of past generations vaults us into higher socioeconomic groups and insulates those people from bad decisions and random economic fluctuations like recessions caused by financial panics or a global pandemic. Those who have ancestors who did not own land and houses, who were prevented from owning land and wealth, have a built-in disadvantage regardless of their own individual decisions. The lack of accumulated wealth of past generations keeps them in lower socioeconomic groups and exposes them to severe punishment from both individual missteps and random economic fluctuations. So what does that mean for Black Americans today? Well, primarily that there is very little that can be done through individual action to narrow that wealth gap. There is very little that anyone can do while we still work within that grand narrative of individual choice that ignores history. I think, after my personal research and thinking about this for a long time, I think that some sort of reparations is the only way. We need an injection of wealth into Black families. There are many different proposals for how those reparations might work. I'm not so sure that any one particular idea is better or worse than others. What I am firmly convinced of is that an injection of wealth into Black families is the only way to close this racial gap in wealth. A racial gap in wealth that affects everyone. When part of our economy is not working to its full potential, all of us suffer. When we lose children who could go to college and do great things because their families cannot afford it, because they don't own wealth, because of 400 years of history, we're all worse off for it. Now, that idea, injecting wealth into Black families, will of course meet huge opposition. The question from that grand narrative of individual choice will be, whoa, isn't that artificial government interference that violates the way we think outcomes should be reached? The government should not be playing favorites and focusing on race instead of rewarding people for their individual choices. Yes, that is exactly what a system of reparations would do. And it's government interference based on racist ideas and policies for centuries that created the problem to begin with. The problem, created by a firm commitment to racist policies, can only be solved by policies that are just as firmly committed to anti-racist ideas. Thank you all for listening for a while. I hope that you have found this helpful.